So I guess that leads us to the next thing. So my view of VDI is that I want VDI to be persistent, so my users can continue to be local admins, so I can continue to install whatever software I want, so the users can install whatever they want, and basically that allows me to take my existing desktop framework, structure management, etc., and drop that into the data center for those scenarios where I need data center-based desktops. And so I'm curious, Ron, on your thoughts on that.
No, I agree with the persistent model, right? Obviously, I think that, I tend to think that in order to make the persistent model really viable to someone, they'll say, okay, well, why would I centralize it if I'm going to patch the same way or distribute apps the same way? It's sometimes easy to do that. The thing that keeps the persistent model from really working, you hit on it a little bit with the storage, is that it's storage, right? I mean, no one's willing to pay 40, 50 gig, 30 gig, maybe even on the smaller side, per desktop on some centralized expensive storage. They're just not willing to do it. EMC would love that. So the trick is you got to shrink the storage down. Now maybe it's inline dedupe or some other model like that. I mean, I tend to still like the image sharing model that'll give you a persistent, whatever that is, right? Whether it's, hey, I've got provisioning server and I dropped Ringcube on top of it, or I have Unidesk and I'm sharing layers, but I have persistence or whatever, because I think there's more of a benefit there on the management side. I mean, it's so funny. I'm not going to say who I was talking to. I was talking to this person at Microsoft 2 weeks ago, where certain groups are trying to wrap their hands around what do we do with VDI, right? And, the honest answer there was so funny. She goes, no one here knows anything outside of their silo. So if I go and I talk to the management guys and I say, look, we got to do something different for VDI, we've got to and they go, well, you patch with SCCM. And she's like, no, we want to do something different. Do you have any new ideas? And they go, yeah, patch with SCCM. and she goes, and I go over and I talk to the Hyper-V guys and I ask them, is there any way we can do this? She goes, yeah, spin up a bunch of full clones, right? So, maybe on their side it's a storage fix. Who knows, right? But I really think that there's two things going on out there. There's the centralization, like you said, and the only way to make that affordable is to get the cost of storage down through inline dedupe or image sharing or whatever. But I actually think there's a play on the management side too. I just think people are I think virtualization itself, even if you do full clones like you suggest, helps with patches and stuff installing via traditional method because there's less variation in drivers and OS builds. So you don't have as many failures. But I really think that, you take that from an enterprise where they have packaging specialists and things work, in high 90%, to that, that company that's, it's not huge, it's not small, it's 550 seats, it's 1,000 seats. And the guy who's trying to run the patching is also the guy who has to monitor all the servers and make sure, some of the backups were running last night. And they're just looking for a simpler model, I think. And that's why they're going to VDI.
So there's a lot to talk about in there. Let's first look into the traditional management. I guess maybe my world has been sort of enterprise focused for too long because I've always sort of thought when it comes to VDI that if we already have ways of managing our desktops, whether it's SCCM or what have you, that we can just sort of continue to do that within our world of VDI. And sure, and I agree with what you were saying, Ron, that I think we'll have more success with VDI because similar the driver bases and just the fact that all the users' desktops are in our building, so we don't have to worry about setting up package and wait till Monday to find out if it ran or whatever. But maybe that is an enterprise-focused thing. I don't know. I don't know what the use. I don't know how many companies out there have desktop management like an SCCM or Altiris. I'm sure probably every sort of large company does. But
yeah. Well, we run into, all the large boys have it. Even if you run into, and let's take the extremes out, right? Take out the, the Goldman Sachs of the world. where they're talking about, 30, 40, 50,000 desktops at a pop.
Yeah, they're like, screw SCCM. That shit's not good enough for us. And
yeah, they're like, we wrote our own shit,
Yeah.
screw you guys. And then on the other side, you've got the really small guys, right? Joe's Plumbing Shop in Akron, Ohio, right? The guy that has 20 desktops total, and a couple of his guys have laptops for mobile quotes or whatever. But take those, take the in-betweens. And even when you think about government's really interesting. And Brian, I know you did a lot of government work when you were at HP back in the day. But, we think of government as, these millions of desktops. But they're all managed by these little groups, right? You go into the military or DODD, or you go into the U.S. Census Bureau, or you go into any of these things, and they all talk about, I manage my 500, I manage my 1,500 desktops, I manage my 4,000 desktops, and that's where they feel that pain, right? It's all these redundant, they have their own little fiefdom, they can do what they want, they have to live up to certain codes or regs or laws that say what they have to do security-wise or reporting-wise. But, that poor guy, he's got 1,500 desktops to deal with, and then he's got all these other things too. And, quite frankly, you should know, Brian, you were an SMS geek way back in the day. How hard is it to package and become a really good application packager or really good at distributing patches, right? It's not an overnight thing in most cases.
Now, on the flip side of that, though, sort of by definition, whatever they're doing now is working because their company's in business, like they have users.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm nervous. One of my big fears about moving to, I guess I could say desktop virtualization, but specifically VDI, is that VDI is such a change just in terms of the general user experience, because you have, you take the desktop away from the user and centralized, and then they have to deal with the different devices and protocols and that kind of stuff. So that's a big change right there. And then at the same time, if we also sort of fundamentally change the way that we're managing desktops, that's a lot to change at once. And my fear is a lot of times VDI projects either get stuck in pilot or fail outright, not because the VDI aspect of it failed, but because this massive change trying to go to whether it's a shared desktop model or something like that, that's the reason that VDI fails.
Right. So rather than changing it all at once, you can, if you can get your desktops into the data center and deal with that first while still managing it the same way you're currently managing your desktops, then that at least lets you take a phased approach to utter completion, utter VDI bliss, if such thing exists.
Well, and I think you hit on it a little bit, but I would flip it. I would say that there's a lot of people that make the decision to go to VDI, kind of like you were saying, Brian, that there's all these things going on that, which protocol do I use and how do I get them remote access and what happens if the network link is down to this remote site and all that stuff. And I think they go there almost in spite of that, right? They're looking a lot of times for a new way to patch or manage. I got a customer, he's a smaller customer in San Antonio, about 500, 800 seats, something like that. But he's like 15 locations, right? And he's all these locations with 20 users, 50 users, 80 users. And for him, it was really, I'm sick of driving out to site whatever every, 3 days to fix this guy's computer and to do that. So it was really, he was looking for a new way to manage. Now the protocols and thin clients and all the other stuff he had to deal with, I think if he could have managed like he did in VDI, some centralized way, reset desktops, push application, I patch some image and it, I don't have to know how to package, I just patch and it goes out, and he didn't have to VDI it, I think he would have done that, but there's really no good tools that, change the way. There's nothing really that fundamentally has changed the way that we patch Windows, that we update applications or install applications. And I think there are some users that are really looking for that.
Now, in that use case for the San Antonio customer, why not something like a Mocha 5 or Virtual Computer or Winova or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Well, he would have, and those might have solved his problems. I know that he would have had to bought new hardware and went with a new model, right? Whether it was a Type 1 hypervisor or whatever. He was kind of sold on the idea of bringing as much as he could centrally, buying some servers, spending the money there, and then they do have thin clients, but they also have some repurposed desktops as thin clients. And he went that direction. I mean, maybe a distributed model would have done that. You know, in our case, in his case specifically, most of his desktops aren't even persistent. I would have to say 70-80% of them aren't even persistent. It's vast majority of it for him was application updates, desktop repairs, and desktop patching. So maybe a distributed model, you know, type 1 hypervisors would have got where we thought they would all be
I wonder
2
if
or 3 years ago.
If you look at a distributed solution that would maybe require that you refresh your hardware to be able to your end user hardware in order to be able to support you know, type 2. I wonder what taking into account everything that we say about cost models, I wonder what the cost model of that endpoint refresh looks like versus going with a centralized solution.
Yeah, and I don't know, right? We have to know that you'd have to have decent hardware. You know, it probably wouldn't have to be Rockstar gaming system type hardware to do it. You'd have to have decent hardware to run a type 1. And we never really know because there haven't been a lot of financial models built around that saying, hey, what's better for me, VDI or the type 1 distributed with management pieces? Really, because those type 1s all burned down when compared to the expectations everyone had for them. They really burned down before anyone got that far. Windows 8, who knows, that might change that.
Doesn't VDI burn down before people get too far?
No, VDI just kept kind of smoldering, I would say, right? Like it was like the guy who doesn't know how to start a fire. He throws 3 logs in a pit and he tosses some gas on it in a match, right? And it flames really big and then it kind of dies down. So he throws more gas on it, right? He just keeps doing that over and over until the logs catch.
So
I watched a guy at a campground do that without the gas.
Regardless, you end up with a pile of ash. Just one of them slowly smoldered while the other one flash fired. And then, so, you know, I wonder, and there's maybe something to be said here also that if you're going to have to spend the money, maybe there's a perception that doing something that's client-based is the sort of quote-unquote the old way of doing things. I'm not advocating this, by the way. I'm just kind of going through this thought exercise where you say, well, if my use case supports allowing VDI, then I also have the flexibility of users to work from other client devices and pop into any computer on the planet and get their desktop and the central backup and that kind of stuff. So maybe there's something like, okay, so there are good future ways to do distributed managed desktops, and that's a, you know, type 1, type 2 hypervisor on the client, something like that. And there's a VDI way, so maybe there's something to that. Like, well, if I'm going to re-engineer what I'm doing now, maybe I should just go with everything in the data center and kind of say goodbye to the managing these endpoints out there.
Yeah. I mean, you know, endpoint management's always been a pain in the butt. I mean, all the way back to the late 90s when, you know, we all thought ASPs would be the end of the world. But what I see is a lot of people, and it's funny because I remember seeing one of your Tech Target spiels a couple of years ago in New York, and one of the things you were harping on, and you probably still do it, it's probably the same spiel, but one of the things you were harping on was VDI. VDI doesn't cost the same as the $300 Dell you shove under your desk, just like, you know, you used to be able to get email in some crappy interface in Windows 3 or Windows 95, but now you get it on a BlackBerry and an iPad, and it does all these other things, so it costs more. You know, that's why we went out and spent a bunch of money on Bez servers back in the day. But I see a lot of people when I go in and I talk to them about, you know, what are you trying to do? They say that. They say, look, we're gonna build VDI to stop managing these desktops this way. But the cool thing is we're going to start testing remote access and bring your own device and, you know, all these other things. So they're really starting, they think VDI is that stepping stone to allowing them to do that.
And it's interesting though, because they're not, and fundamentally VDI does not remove their need for having to manage instances of Windows, you know, and I think that that's one of the big misconceptions. Maybe Windows becomes easier to manage because, as you said earlier, if they're all VMs, they all have the same sort of core driver set, and they're all in their own basement, so they're easy to update and stuff. And I guess fundamentally, you know, I mean, my feeling was always if your VDI environment is able to work off these shared non-persistent models, then Maybe you can get some management savings from that, but you still have to deal with applications that are not compatible and user environment, all that kind of stuff. So there's no way you're leaving the world of Windows management at all.
No, there's still a lot of Windows in there, that's for sure. I mean, you would be surprised at the number of calls that I get or the support guys get on basic Windows things. I mean, just we're Unidesk, right? We're there for their apps and building a desktop, and someone will call up and say, this guy can't do this, and we'll wind up Googling, the error for some Microsoft knowledge base article on, they didn't install something in their Windows package, so they still wind up doing that. I think that VDI without a management system. I mean, think about it. If you had View or Zen Desktop with no image sharing, would anybody move to it?
Goldman Sachs.
Well, yeah, but they did their whole weird thing with individual terminal servers and whatnot, right? But yeah, I mean, how many people would be flocking to it if we said, well, here's what you're going to do. You're going to make these things VMs. You're going to run WSUS or SCCM on them, and you're going to have a guy that can package apps over here, and you're going to have this guy that can, some might do it for remote access, kind of along the lines of last week where Claudio was, talking about these people wanted to remote access their desktops. But not a lot, right? A lot of people they're really looking for a different way to update desktops. They're still going to have to update them, but they want to make it simple.
Now, we're sure if it was that alluring to do persistent stuff, or static images without any other built-in management, everybody would be doing it. But it's too complex.
Yeah, I mean, people. Yeah, and it was funny. I always talk about View Composer because I was at Glasshouse and then Dell, big VMware shops. And I was at a meeting at VMware once where they introduced the concept of Composer before it became an actual product. And the solution was to do two things. And that, we want to reduce the storage footprint, and we want to make it so you can patch an image once and push it to everybody. We want to make it so that, you don't have to package a fix. You don't have to use WSUS. You don't have to do any of these things. You patch this image once, you say go, and it goes out. And it does those two things really well, right? I mean, we've seen they had to go out and get an AppVert product, and they had to buy RTO, and they had to do all those things. But that's what they had to do to make people buy VDI, because if you just moved a bunch of thick images centrally, the admin guy didn't see that it made his job any easier from a management perspective.
But now Composer, to me, seems like the most craziest, amongst the crazy products in the world, Composer is there. And this is not, I mean, it's the same with NetApp Flex clones, and I mean, a lot of this kind of stuff, provisioning services. And actually the new HyperCache stuff from Quest Software, which only work. All of these products that require a shared master image, and then they make all these little Delta differential files for all the users, so they can have the the personalization that each VM needs to physically boot up and have a different identity and stuff. But when you update your master and then recompose, you blow away all those settings changes for all those individual users. And so that just goes back to my one of my arguments I've been giving for a few years. I mean, so Composer only works for non-persistent desktops.
Yep.
So if you're doing all that, I mean, geez, why aren't you just using Terminal Server and doing the whole thing with 3x the user density?
Which is what I say a lot, right? Is that it's great for a non-persistent thing, non-persistent workspace for a user, but because it was built on the block level, everything has. Think about it. Because of the way Composer was designed, or any block-based image sharing was designed, you have to go out and get an application tool, a profile tool, AppSense, Res, RTO, whatever it is, or else it's a terminal server with no roaming profiles.
And way more expensive.
And way more expensive, right?
And stupid-ass licensing.
And crazy Microsoft licensing.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is I always start off my presentations when I do demos explaining that to people when I'm just talking about Unidesk, because that's one of the things. We didn't actually want to be in the non-persistent business. I was talking to someone yesterday at Unidesk, bringing them up to speed. When we first rolled out the product in beta and version 1 and whatnot, there was no non-persistent desktop in Unidesk. We're like, well, that's covered. Go buy Terminal Server, go buy View. It was later, after people bought our system and used it, that they said, we want to do this with our non-persistent desktops. Now, while I may think that if a desktop is non-persistent, you should first try it on terminal services, and then use. If a customer tells me he wants to buy a product for non-persistent, we're going to make it for him. But you're dead on. If you can do non-persistent, try RDS first, then move to a composer or something like that. And what we found was that they weren't coming to us because our image sharing was necessarily any better. It was that we didn't do it at the block level. So all those things that you talked about, even our non-persistent desktops, the computer name, the domain SID, all that stuff that happens when a machine is first built are retained. We try not to kill all that stuff that makes a desktop kind of what a desktop is.
Well, so I think you answered a question from earlier, because you mentioned this customer in San Antonio with 70 or 80% of that person's VDI desktops being non-persistent, and I was sort of going to ask you, what the hell?
Yeah. Well, it was kind of twofold. It was about the applications, right? I mean, he tried some thin app. They looked at other things. He never found anything that just worked for him. And of course, for the 20% that were persistent, they needed to be persistent. But the difference with us is that since we're not doing it at the block level, since the OS and the apps and everything is in a layer essentially, you can retain all that stuff that you were talking about. You can retain the computer name and the domain SID, and frickin' when Semantic Antivirus boots the first time and it writes a UUID into the registry and registers with the enterprise management server, it all looks and acts like it should, versus a recompose where essentially the desktops are blown away and recreated with the same name.